So next up, podcast listeners, we have Go Woke or Go Broke. We have to get music for that at some point. So we have Go Woke or Go Broke, and it's Facebook continues their Trump ban. Of course, because Facebook is probably the most woke corporation in America, and they have banned Donald Trump, and they decided to re-look at the issue, if you will, to revisit the issue, better term, and they revisited it, and what did they decide to do? Well, we're going to continue to ban Donald Trump. So in the Daily Wire, it says, Facebook's oversight board are feckless bureaucrats doing nothing but wasting time as our freedom of speech is taken away. And here's what they say. On Wednesday, Facebook's oversight board, I'm sure they're all probably like 15 years old, announced that, unsurprisingly, they were upholding the big tech giant's deep controversial decision to suspend former President Donald Trump's accounts on both Facebook and Instagram. The board has upheld Facebook's decision on January 7th, 2021 to restrict then-President Donald Trump's access to posting content on his Facebook page and Instagram account, a statement read. Facebook's oversight board found that the two posts by Mr. Trump on January 6th severely violated Facebook's community standards and Instagram's community guidelines, claiming that phrases like, "we love you," "you're very special," "great patriots," and "remember this day forever" had violated Facebook's rules prohibiting praise or support of people engaged in violence. You have to remember, of course, podcast listeners, on January 6th, there were probably, 200,000-300,000 people that were in downtown Washington, D.C., and there was a small minority of people who broke into the Capitol. I'm pretty sure the President of the United States was referring to the people who were actually at the rally and peacefully protesting the way the election was conducted in 2020. I have no doubt about that. But if you have a doubt about that, Facebook, then why don't you ask Donald Trump to rephrase what he meant, give him that opportunity, and ask him what he would put to rephrase it so that he can repost it and say, look, I was talking about my supporters and the idea and the uniquely American concept of peaceful protest, and then have him reinstated. But no, Facebook doesn't want to do that. They want to find every reason they can to not reinstate him. It's just so obvious. Thoughts on this, Brian?
Well, this is, at the very bottom line, this is just a banning of any debate. It's the banning of any other opinion. I think Facebook's big overarching thought on this is we're going to have the last word. We're going to call him an insurrectionist, or he was the worst man that's ever been in the White House.
A rogue president.
Right. We're not going to let him defend himself with his own words and his own thoughts and his own definition. And I've heard him, as well as you and myself have said, not a single conservative, nor do we condone the violence at the Capitol that day. Matter of fact, it was the worst thing that we could have ever seen. But the vast, vast majority of the people there were there to show support and to peacefully protest.
And I know many of them.
Right. And now Facebook just doesn't want that to be. They want to deliver their own opinion on this and not have somebody come back and deliver their opinion on it. And that's communism right there. That is,
of course,
one voice, no debate. This is what we say. And I mean, I think it's safe to say that the Democrat Party is motivated by fear.
Oh my gosh, yes.
We're more voted by freedom and opportunity, and they fear Donald Trump speaking. That's the bottom line. They don't want him to ever be heard again, because 74 million people still voted for that man. At least 74 million, because that's not even a debate. They'll acknowledge that. It's just that somehow Biden, staying in his basement, got 6 million more than that somehow. I don't know.
So imagine this group of people at Facebook, and they decide, well, we're afraid, and I agree with you, Brian, they're terrified of what he might say. But I wanted to clarify what I just said before to all podcast listeners. Because we live in Maryland, which for the most part is a suburb of Washington, D.C., because it's a small state, we have to say this. We know a lot of people who were there on January 6th. By there, I don't mean breaking into the Capitol. I know no one who broke into the Capitol. I'm talking about people who were there, and they were protesting peacefully in support of Donald Trump, and protesting peacefully in opposition of the way the election was conducted in 2020. And that is a perfectly legitimate thing to do no matter who you support or oppose. And when you talk to those people, they're like, I didn't even know any of that stuff was happening.
That's right.
Because that's how many people were there. And yet, Facebook, of course, doesn't want to give anyone a second chance. And so this is really important stuff because MSNBC is still talking about this because that's the only way they can try to bounce their ratings up, because their ratings are completely as low. They've been lower than I think they've ever been ever since Trump left office. So MSNBC, of course, agrees with the ban, and they had an expert panel on recently. And this professor, Jen Gobeck, who's a professor at the University of Maryland. Why do they use Maryland? Because, of course, at University of Maryland, it's very liberal, very progressive, and it's also really close to Washington, D.C., where MSNBC, of course, has many of its studios. So they had this University of Maryland professor who is a professor at the Maryland College of Information Studies. I'm not sure what that has to do with anything. But they asked her question about the ban. And listen to this insult that she gives. Here's the clip.
Professor Goldbeck, let me start with you, only because the response to the Facebook decision, wherever you stand on this issue, by some Republicans has been that it is a violation of the First Amendment. That, on its face, is not true.
No, I'm always astonished, even though they have pushed this narrative really since Trump started running for president, that they think somehow having a private platform adhere to their own terms of service somehow violates the Constitution. Of course, that's not how it works. We're all held with those terms of service that we agree to follow the rules that the platform set forth. There's a lot of things you're not allowed to say on those platforms that the government would never regulate because of the First Amendment. But it sounds good, and it really appeals to people who have a kind of elementary school level understanding of what free speech means.
Oh, so there you go. Jen Goldbeck, professor at the University of Maryland, thinks you're too stupid because you've only got like an elementary school understanding of what free speech means. When, of course, what she's doing is forgetting some really important information. And here's some of that information, Brian, namely that Facebook, because of its power and size, has managed to run almost every major newspaper out of business, because Facebook has become a de facto newspaper, as well as a de facto radio station and television station, and you name it, an information sharing organization. And as a result, Facebook is a utility because it's so big, so powerful, run its competitors out of business, including the print media. And so her point is, it doesn't really apply to them because they're just like this little tiny company that really isn't hurting anyone, when in fact, of course, they have so much control over what is said and what is heard that they, of course, are utility and should be, of course, heavily regulated and maybe even broken up. Thoughts?
I would agree with you. And they receive millions upon billions of dollars in federal subsidies. So they're being funded in part by the federal government, and then they're going out and shutting down any opposition view to the party that they tend to side with, which is always the left, the most progressive Democrats they can. So their idea is we'll use the federal money to shut the voices of anybody in opposition of our team. So now we're going once again to just one voice can never be heard.
Absolutely, and Facebook, of course. It's really interesting how Zuckerberg has done this. He has this little group of 15-year-olds, as I like to call them, who are making the decision as to who gets, of course, banned and who gets shadow banned. And at the same time, Zuckerberg just stands above Facebook as like, oh, they're all making the decisions. I have nothing to do with it. And of course, meanwhile, it's like, well, that's really hard to believe, right? Because Zuckerberg used Zuckerbucks in the 2020 election with his wife and put $350 million into influencing the outcome of the election. And I have no doubt influenced the outcome of the election in all of the swing states, resulting in a Joe Biden presidency. That I have no doubt about. So is there any question that this company's too big and too powerful? I mean, so when they engage in censorship, is there any question this is a problem? Final thoughts on this, Brian.
Yeah, that's one man and one company now influencing or determining the fate of 330 million people.
Exactly.
That's all it is, and that's bordering on evil and destructive to the point where I agree with you. you can't have something so big that you're now quashing out all companies. That's why we have antitrust laws, correct?
Absolutely.
So that we don't have just one company imposing their will on everybody.
On everybody else.
That's where we are.
And that's the final word on Mark of the Millennials. That's go woke or go broke. Thank you for joining Mark of the Millennials. A special thanks to Delegate Brian Chisholm. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Parler, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.